Well, hello everybody, and welcome to another little video about medieval medicine, which is the first of the 4 time periods on the AQA Health and the People paper. I just need to start by apologising, well, for two things really. Firstly, it's been brought to my attention that I say a lot. There it goes. Not much I can do about that, I'm afraid. I hope that doesn't get in the way of your listening pleasure. And the second thing I've realised is that the book is back to front. I think that's the case. That's because I'm using the forward facing camera on my phone. There's not much I can do about that either. The only thing I can suggest is that we kind of concentrate on looking at the pictures and perhaps just use a textbook just as a reminder of the pages that you've looked at in lesson, because most of you, I think, have sort of seen this stuff already before, and it's just a case of kind of just reminding yourself of what you've seen. I'm very self-conscious about the erming now, which is probably going to make it worse, but we'll go as well as we can. So this video, what we're just going to talk about is the medieval explanations for disease, what people thought caused disease, and what people, which people in society then provided healthcare and treatment based on that, and what treatments and healthcare might have been available in a kind of general sense. So we'll start with what they thought caused disease. And I think, as we said in the last video, medieval society was very religious. The church was controlled the flow of information to people. And therefore, one of the prime kind of explanations for disease was, God and the supernatural. And people were very superstitious in the Middle Ages. They had a very sort of this particular view of the world as being this battleground between good and evil, a battleground between the forces of God and the forces of the devil, I suppose. And ill health and poor, hygiene, poor health was viewed through the lens of that particular way of looking at the world. So one of the primary explanations for anybody being ill was that it was either, you've got two explanations here. One is that it was sent as a punishment by God to that person for some form of sin that they'd committed, or it might even be that, on the other hand, maybe the person themselves is good, but the devil has brought disease to them as part of his war on, God's people, I suppose. Okay, so really that kind of dual emphasis on God and the devil being the causes of disease. Now, there was some evidence for this in the eyes of people in the Middle Ages. So, for example, they read the Bible as being the true word of God, and therefore, when the Bible talks about plague being sent to Egypt by God, people interpreted, in the Middle Ages, people interpreted plague and any disease that spread through a whole sort of city or area of society as having been sent by God to punish that city or area of society. So, for instance, often people in cities were, plagued by poor health, obviously for reasons that we understand, such as infection from spreading throughout the population. But in the Middle Ages, they might have seen that as a punishment from God to the city for it having broken God's rules, or for it having, gone against what was said in the Bible. So cities, civilizations, countries picked out by God for punishment because of them perhaps rejecting the truth of God's word in the Bible, that kind of thing, would be an explanation for infectious diseases that we now know would be spreading through a population through kind of contagion and infection. So that's one aspect of it, and evidence from that comes both from the Bible and from the fact that in cities or towns in the Middle Ages, that's where there was more access to the kinds of things that religious people thought were against God's judgments. So access to pubs and alcohol and all those kind of things that go with it, that would be found in the city. And in the city is where you might catch diseases, and we know why that is now, but in the Middle Ages they put two and two together and made five. And would have perhaps said, well, that was maybe a punishment from God to that city or that town because of their sort of poor behaviour. Alternatively, another example is this idea of kind of possession by the devil or possession by his demons, that bring disease and bring illness into people's bodies, because that's a battleground for this kind of battle between good and evil. In that case, you might be thinking in terms of things like epilepsy and mental health issues as we would understand them, mental health illnesses. But in the Middle Ages, they were perceived very much in terms of like demonic possession and people, having demons kind of coming and going inside them, in the same way that Jesus cast out demons in the Bible. The other element of God, before we move on to some of the other causes, was there was something known as the doctrine of signatures, which is that if God is in the end a kind and loving God, as he's portrayed in the Bible in the end, then why would he create diseases and illnesses without also giving us the cure to those illnesses and diseases? And the idea here goes back to the kind of concept that maybe the whole world was designed, and if God has designed certain cures for certain diseases, then all we need to do is we need to look for those cures in the environment. So we might look for, in the same way that a signature stands for a person, so every person has their own signature, well, every disease might have its own signature out there in nature, which would be something we could find that then we could treat that disease with. So you might think of certain plants that are shaped like organs of the body, or certain plants that have sort of distinguishing features that look like the symptoms of certain diseases, and all you've got to do is kind of link the two together and use them. Now, any of those plants and cures, things like that, they're not going to be normal everyday things. They're going to be the more unusual, exotic things that are a bit strange and bizarre. So you're thinking here about strong tasting plants. You're thinking here about things that are sort of unusual in their own way. So, for example, mercury being a metal that's liquid at room temperature, the only one. So it's not iron that's picked out as perhaps being a cure sent by God. It's not steel. It's not, brass or whatever. It's mercury, because mercury is different and unusual. And God has made it different and unusual to highlight it to us as a cure for a particular disease. In this case, I think it was used for smallpox. But the point being that you're looking for things that are unusual in the environment as giving you an idea from God of it being some form of medicine. Rhubarb is another example, strong tasting. Anything that perhaps comes from distant lands might be common over there, but in Britain, in the Middle Ages, in England, it was unusual to have herbs and spices. So those herbs and spices that aren't grown here, they come from faraway places. They're unusual. God sent them as a kind of something for us to know about. So that's the doctrine of signatures. So you have to look in nature for the cure for certain diseases. Now, the truth is that every single medicine that we now have, however kind of manufactured it might be, ultimately does come from nature. Everything we have on planet Earth comes from planet Earth. So there's something there in terms of, the beginnings of the concept of medicine, but obviously it's interpreted through this kind of religious way of looking at the world. Okay. Another really important cause of disease, or expected or thought of cause of disease, was the four humours, which we looked at in the last video. And again, it's that case of, everything has to be in balance. The four humours have to be in balance. But a lot of these things become, we might put them into compartments and say, oh, that's an explanation to do with God, that's to do with the four humours. But in the medieval mind, a lot of these things overlapped. So the theory of the four humours, for example, doesn't really tell you why the humours became out of balance, just that they're out of balance and you've got to get rid of that imbalance. Well, you might kind of combine that with the idea of God. Maybe God is making humours come out of balance. So these things kind of interlink as well, even though we would argue that the four humours is more scientifically based than theories of religion and God. Okay. Another one that we might think of as more scientifically based is the concept of bad smells causing disease, which is also called miasma theory. A miasma is a bad smell, bad air, bad wind, those kind of things causing disease, is a key sort of explanation from the Middle Ages as well. And it lasts well into the Renaissance and even into sort of up to the time of maybe John Snow in the 19th century, that perhaps bad air is what's causing disease. Now, there's lots of reasons for thinking bad air might cause disease. Number one, things that are unwell smell bad, but the smelling bad is a symptom of that. It's not a cause of them being unwell. The bad smell is a symptom of them being unwell, not a cause of it. They've mixed up symptoms and causes in the same way or a similar way to how the four humors did the same thing. So in this case, you've got bad air or bad smells or miasma, which is traveling around from one place to another. And there's another explanation for why they might have thought this caused disease, because as we know, diseases move invisibly from one place to another through viruses or bacteria. Obviously, in the Middle Ages, God created the universe. Why would he make, the whole universe is a message for humans. Why would there be things that are too small to see? How can that be a part of the message? Therefore, they didn't even really think that perhaps there was a whole microbial, tiny universe that we couldn't see, in the same way they didn't understand the size of space, because that kind of throws into question the concept that the whole universe was made as a message for human beings. So, we know that microbes and viruses are, really quite central to life on Earth, but that wasn't anything that would make any sense to someone from the Middle Ages. So they knew that things travelled and diseases travelled, and they know that the other thing that travels is wind, that travels from one place to another. So perhaps, bad wind, miasma, is moving through landscapes, taking disease, or is causing disease in one place and then moving to another place and causing disease there as well. Now, again, we know that it's the wrong way round. Things go off and they make a bad smell. But the bad smell isn't the thing that's making whatever it is go off. Okay? And as I said earlier, with the concept of God, you can mix these things up and you can say, well, okay, miasma sounds like a fairly scientific idea. At least we're observing. We've got a sort of rational explanation for what's causing disease. But in the medieval mind, it might have been that God had sent the evil wind. God had sent the miasmic wind, or the devil had sent the evil wind to travel through the landscape, as a punishment for people. So these things got very much wrapped up together. Another one that kind of comes into this is the concept of the supernatural, which was really central to life in the Middle Ages. You've got to remember that, we're very familiar with the idea that, the whole of Britain, England, is tamed. There's no real wilderness here. We're not kind of living like they did in the Middle Ages in little islands of civilization that we would now call towns and villages, with a kind of uncultivated, wild, untamed landscape around them. In the Middle Ages, it was treacherous, really, to kind of leave Beverley and ride to Hornsey on your kind of horse. That was treacherous. It was dangerous. There were robbers. There were, highway men. There were kind of people outside the law. It's forest between those two places. It's going to take half a day to get there, half a day to get back. If you don't make it back, nobody would really know what happened to you. A little bit like going out to sea now, I suppose, in a little boat or something, without anybody really knowing what, you just disappear. Well, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about in the Middle Ages. And it's not much of a leap to kind of say, well, there's highwaymen and there's robbers and there's bears, which there would have been, and wolves, and maybe there's demons, and maybe there's ghosts, and maybe there's all kinds of other things that are going on in the supernatural world that we would say were supernatural. But to them, they lived surrounded by this. So, that would be quite central to their explanation. So maybe, infections, as we would know them, diseases, are caused by demons, caused by ghosts, caused by hexes, by spells cast by witches that are living on the fringes of society. And these people who are perhaps living out in the forested areas between the towns and cities are going to be strange, unusual people, because why else would they live there? They're maybe the outcasts from society. How do they survive? Do they have some secret mystical powers that they can use? Oh, they seem to be kind of gathering herbs from the woods, making potions. Well, gathering herbs and potions sounds like medicine until you say some fancy words over the top of it, and then it begins to be a spell, and then you're into kind of supernatural. So the boundaries between, what we would call the kind of natural world and the supernatural world were quite fluid in the Middle Ages. So again, and that's all promoted by the church as well, because they want people to see the world as a supernatural battleground, because then people will be like, well, how can I stay on the good side? Well, maybe listen to the church, etc. So that kind of emphasis on, no real distinction between the worlds of magic and superstition and the natural world. Okay, so we've got there, God, the four humours, miasma theory, and supernatural explanations. And then there's one more thing just to be aware of, is that, we live in a civilization now where, lockdown aside, we expect to live long lives that are lacking in pain, that are healthy generally. And these, this is a privilege that we have in Western civilization that isn't even shared by everybody in the world at this time. Certainly wasn't part of the medieval experience of being a human being. Most animals, I would argue, out there in the natural world, they kind of put up with a fair amount of pain and distress from the hard lives that animals have, living out in the countryside, no house, that kind of stuff. And that would have been much the case in the Middle Ages. If you want to repair your roof, there isn't a guy who comes to do it from the council, or a guy who comes to do it, from such and such a company. You just get up on the roof yourself and you fix it. And you take the risk that you slip off the roof and break your leg and the bone comes out, you're losing a leg or you're going to die. So there was an expectation that people would live, lives that were short in our way of thinking about things, and largely filled with pain and, distress, discomfort. So it was kind of seen as natural, when so many children died in their infant years, and so many women would die in childbirth. There was an expectation that people would live lives that were surrounded by illness and disease, that we've kind of moved away from now. So, another explanation for it is just, well, that's just everyday life. That is we now live in this privileged position where we don't have, or we generally don't think like that. But in the Middle Ages, people did. Okay, so really we've got God, the four humours, miasma, and supernatural as our explanations for the causes of disease. Okay, so if we then kind of switch our focus onto who would treat the sick in the Middle Ages, depending on how you count it, we've got maybe 5 or 7 people, or different types of people. So we'll go through them one at a time and see how many we come up with on this particular occasion. We could go from those that were kind of the cheapest to those that were most expensive, because in the Middle Ages everybody had to pay for their healthcare in one way or another, I guess. There was no, obviously, national health service. So if we start kind of with the very cheapest, if you like, we can call this person the lady of the house, but we would most usually nowadays refer to them as, mum, because the role of caring for members of the household fell to women. And so if you became ill, it wouldn't cost anything in this case, but you would, perhaps it would be the woman's responsibility, the housewife, if you like, be their responsibility to provide healing for the family. So that's obviously just done in the home with things that are readily available. It might include going off into the forest to find herbs and potions, herbs and plants to make into potions. It might involve buying some things from the apothecary, who we'll see in a minute, but it was the woman's job to provide the healthcare. Now, that's due to kind of gendered roles in society in the Middle Ages, but it's also due to the fact that we again have this kind of distinction between, well, I think 3 things really. We'd make a distinction between food, drugs, and medicine. But in the Middle Ages, there wasn't that distinction between food, drugs, and medicine. The lady of the house was responsible for feeding the family. You got a pain in your tummy, you eat some food, the pain goes away. You got a pain in your head, you eat some herbs, the pain goes away. There's not a great difference there. And again, we have sort of categorization of drugs, but we're talking really about herbs that would be used for treatment. And nowadays, some of those would be seen as drugs. So, for example, opium poppies, or sort of things that grew in the forest that we might sort of categorize as drugs or have become the basis for medicines in the modern world, would be things that the lady of the house might gather for her family. If she had a large household, it might include servants. If she might also have people in the village. If she was maybe a lady of the manor house, might have people in the village who would come to her for healing. If she was kind of the lady of the manor, farmer's wife might sort of provide healthcare for farm workers, that kind of thing. But the lady of the house, that wouldn't cost any money. It would just be part of her job as the mum, if you like. In the same way as well, you'd have a family cookbook that perhaps would be passed down through the female generations, and that would include, both kind of food recipes and healing, and medical recipes. There probably wouldn't be any distinction between those very much, but that would be passed down from one generation to the next, with each generation adding more and more recipes as they kind of came up with them. And that's how kind of medical knowledge would be passed down through families, perhaps. Okay, and that obviously needs a level of literacy, so wouldn't even be available to all families either. Okay, second person who might provide healing, again for the poor, would be someone that we might call the wise woman, who you could also call a witch. So if you like her, she's the wise woman. If you've fallen out with her, she's the witch. And she would be one step up from maybe the lady of the house in terms of a sort of specialist knowledge of sort of herbs in the forest. And again, we're talking about those kind of people who are on the margins of society, who are trading in a sort of specialist understanding that they have. That's how they survive economically. And if you went to see the wise woman, you would be needing to trade things with her. Perhaps you had some sheep and you'd swap them with her for a potion or something like that, in order to get some healing for your family. She's going to be doing a combination of creating kind of potions, using herbs, but also spells, special words said over potions to create kind of magic entities of them. And like I say, if she's opening herself up to accusations of witchcraft, if people in the village fall out with her, but if you're on her side, she's a wise woman. Okay, and she's part of that kind of mix between a rational scientific approach of taking things from the environment, looking at symptoms, but also with this kind of edge of a supernatural background as well. Okay, you might, if you have a little bit more money, you might be able to access the barber surgeon. And the barber surgeon was someone who, as his name implies, essentially was the hairdresser for the town. Usually you wouldn't really necessarily get one in a village, wouldn't be enough people to support them, but he's now this is a profession, this is a job, rather than lady of the house, wise woman. It's just what they do. But this person, he has a job, he has a role in society as a barber, and because he's going to sort of be shaving beards and cutting hair, I've got the lockdown look at the moment, shaving beards and cutting hair, he's going to have access to some of the more valuable objects in society, which would be made of metal, which we would think of as maybe cutthroat razors, scissors, that kind of thing that the barber surgeon would have. And he was both barber and surgeon. So if you needed some operation doing, you might go to the barber surgeon and he would be able to operate on you. As we've discussed in class, he's not going to do anything on the torso at all. It's a big, blank, pink, mushy area. Not going to get involved in that at all, unless the only exception to that is that he might do some operations up your bum. But he's not going to cut into you at all, and for reasons that I'll explain in just a sec. Instead, the only places that he's going to really operate on are kind of fingers, hands, arms, legs, feet, He might do things around your face or your head, but he's not going to go into this area at all because it's just too dangerous. Okay, the barber surgeon is going to specialize in amputations. If you've got a part of your body that's causing you a problem, he's not really going to fix it. He's going to remove it for you, in the hope that that's obviously going to solve the problem. So he might gouge out an eye if you've got something wrong with your eye. He might chop off a finger if you've got something wrong with your finger. He might amputate an arm if you've got a fracture, particularly like a complex fracture where the bone's sticking out. And this is a dangerous these are dangerous procedures for you to go through, because you might have problems with shock, you might have problems with what we would know as infection, you might have problems with blood loss. And that reminds us of the three main problems in surgery, which is pain, which causes shock, which is infection, and blood loss. So it's pain, infection, blood loss. That are the three problems that we need to overcome with surgery throughout history. And in the Middle Ages, they are three main massive problems that the barber surgeon can't deal with, because he has no anaesthetic for the pain, he has no understanding of infection, and he has very limited ability to prevent blood loss. Okay, for pain, you could hit someone over the head and knock them out, but you might cause brain damage. You could give them alcohol, get them drunk. That's going to help with the pain a bit. They did know about the pain relieving properties of some things, like for instance opium, which we would now still use in hospitals as a painkiller. The same stuff as heroin, basically. And that tells us that obviously it's very extremely dangerous. So in the Middle Ages, they might use that, but they wouldn't be able to get the proportions right. So he's got problems with pain, infection. He has no kind of understanding of what's causing infections. And for blood loss, the technique that would be used would be cauterization. So a barber surgeon would heat up a metal plate in the fire. He would chop your arm off, and then he would cauterize the end of your stump, which is essentially putting the hot plate onto the end and basically melting the flesh and the veins and the arteries together, so that the blood so they melt together and the blood can't come out. And that's the main process for cauterization, which reminds us why they couldn't operate on the body, because you've got sort of a cut here and you've kind of gone into your body. It's very hard to cauterize that, whereas the end of a bloody stump where you've had your arm cut off, you can cauterize that quite easily by putting relatively easy by putting the hot plate on. That cauterization process, and that process of amputation, 90% death rate, 10% survival rate. So you're only going to do it if your possibilities of survival are less than 10% if you don't get it done. So for instance, we're talking, like I say, a complex fracture where the bone's sticking out. You're going to get an infection in your bone, and you're going to get from that you're going to get sepsis, and you're going to die. So you are going to go for the amputation even though it's a 90% chance of death, because you're facing something much worse, and all you've been trying to do, remember, was fixing your roof. So life was very treacherous for these people. So that's your barber surgeon, lady of the house, wise woman. Another one we can talk about is monks and nuns. Monks, nuns, and priests, which is why we got to 6 at one point. So monks, nuns, and priests, they're kind of addressing the religious-based explanations for disease. So you might go to a priest for exorcism, you might go to nuns for some kind of care, particularly if you're elderly, you might get some care from nuns because you're elderly, in what we would now think of as perhaps being the forerunners to a hospital, and the same thing with monks. But at the same time, they did have kind of some understanding of herbal medicines as well, and herbal remedies as well. So monks would have what's called the cloister, which is what they live around, and in the middle of there would be like a garden where they're growing herbs and they're growing plants that can be used for healing. So monks, nuns, and priests is kind of 3, 4, 5, I guess. We can also then talk about the people who would cost a lot of money. I appreciate this video has now been going on for half an hour, so I'll stop after this. 2 people who would cost a lot of money. The first one is the apothecary, who we've already mentioned. He wouldn't directly provide healing so much as He might do diagnosis. So you go to him with a particular problem, and he might read your zodiac chart. He might read your, might think about your four humours, but he's going to be providing you with the closest thing that in the Middle Ages they had to what we would now think of as chemicals. So there weren't chemists as such in the Middle Ages. There were alchemists. Alchemists were people who were on the fringes of kind of what we might think of as science. Alchemy was essentially the trying to turn metals into gold, and these alchemists were the forerunners of chemists, I think, in some ways. And an apothecary might have kind of powders and powdered up sort of minerals and rocks and things that would later form the basis of chemistry, but at this time were kind of used for alchemy to try and turn metals into gold. But he would also have access to these and perhaps provide them as kind of a medical treatment. The apothecary would sell what were known as simples and compounds. Well, we know what compounds are because we still have those in science when you combine different elements together. But a simple would just be a single kind of ingredient. So you might go to the alchemist, the apothecary. You might go to the apothecary, ask them for, say I've got this particular problem. He would say, oh, you've got, these are your humours that are out of balance. If you make a potion up with this ingredient, and this ingredient, you can take that and it will get your humours back into balance. He's going to cost quite a lot of money, mostly because the things that he's getting are from far away, because they're the things that, remember, God has put on the earth to help us treat illnesses. These are things that are unusual and bizarre, and anything unusual that there isn't very much of costs an extra large amount of money. So an apothecary is going to be quite expensive. You would probably use coins to pay him in the same way that you might use coins for the barber surgeon. Not like the wise woman where you'd be swapping things that you have with them. He's going to use coinage, and he's going to be for people who are in the kind of aristocracy. And he's going to be urban. People who live in towns would go to an apothecary. And the final person to kind of think about is a university educated doctor. So I think, as we said in the first video, university educated doctors were not educated or trained in the way that we would understand now. Instead, they might learn the works of Galen. It was like an academic idea of teaching. So it's very much sort of based on book learning, not on investigation or finding things out for themselves. But we've got actually here, if we look here, we've got a picture of a lesson in dissection, because occasionally there were like practical classes. I think so you're looking at maybe every couple of years there might be one kind of sort of practical lesson, but really you've got the students would sit around the outside and watch the dissection. You've got the guy reading from Galen's book here, and he's reading out the things that are being pointed out by the people doing the dissection. It's not a hands-on experience for the students who are being trained as doctors. They're not getting to do it themselves, and all the time their understanding of the body is coloured by what they're hearing from this guy who's reading from Galen. And as we said last video, Galen was dissecting animals anyway, so much of what he'd written was wrong. Very few dissections because the church were controlling the flow of dead bodies, for two reasons, I guess. One is that you don't want people to question the Bible. You don't want them to kind of look and investigate for themselves. Remember, and it's not that they were being cruel or hiding the truth from people. It's just the way of medieval thinking that there was no questions worth asking that weren't answered in the Bible. So that's the first reason. The second reason would be that they didn't, the body was needed for the afterlife. And it's part of kind of God's role to look after bodies after death, not human beings. So there's your university educated doctor. For the king, for the real nobility, in Paris or London, not for even your ordinary everyday aristocrat wouldn't have access to a doctor of that type. Okay, so causes of disease: God, bad smells, supernatural, four humours. people who treated the ill, wise woman, lady of the house, apothecary, monks, priests, nuns, university educated doctor. That's 35 minutes. That's a wrap. I'll get another video out to you in a few days. Okay, hope everybody's well and stay safe, and see you sometime in the future. Take care, everyone. Bye bye.